Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode, where I'm speaking with Giacomo Sanfilippo.
Giacomo.
Oh no, I got it wrong. Right? I should have asked right before we started as well. I can't believe it. Giacomo Sanfilippo, and you're an Orthodox Christian, a former priest, and a father of 5, and grandfather of 3. And currently you're a PhD candidate in theological studies at Trinity College in the University of Toronto. And you're known within and outside of the Orthodox Church for your creation and management of the blog Orthodoxy in Dialogue, your MA thesis on an Orthodoxy theology and spirituality of same-sex love, and your doctoral research is on Father Pavel Florensky's theology of same-sex love. And your untiring, I forgot how to read it, it's the end of a long day, your untiring advocacy for a better theological and pastoral response to sexual and gender diversity in human and nature and ecclesial life. So I came across you on Twitter basically through I guess mutual connections to do with Eastern Orthodoxy and like LGBT issue advocacy, and you're someone within the church who advocates for those kind of things. Is there anything else you want to add to that brief introduction about what it is that you do around your blog and your PhD currently?
No, that sounds pretty thorough. Thank you for that, and thank you for having me here. I'm honored to be here. I've looked at your other work on your YouTube channel, and it's very impressive. So I'm very honored that you've invited me to be part of this.
Awesome. Well, thank you. So I guess I gave you a kind of list of questions to approximately guide this conversation beforehand. And the first one in there is, how was homosexuality understood in the kind of context of the New Testament? So at the time that the New Testament's kind of being formed, around the time of Jesus's life, how is homosexuality understood by those people, the people that we come across in the Gospels?
Right. I think I have to start by problematizing the word homosexual and homosexuality. Even though some English translations of the Bible use that word, for instance, some versions have St. Paul saying that neither shall homosexuals nor the effeminate inherit the kingdom of God. Well, that's an egregious anachronism to use the word homosexual, and I think it reflects perhaps the bias of the editors rather than an honest choice. I mean, obviously, any translation, especially a translation from an ancient language into a modern language, is going to involve some degree of paraphrasing. That's the word I'm looking for. Some degree of paraphrasing. So I think most people know that the word homosexual, first of all, is an awkward neologism because the prefix is Greek, and the suffix or the root is Latin. So homo in Greek means the same. And so not only is that a neologism that did not exist before the mid to late 1850s, but the concept that it was created to express also did not exist until the early days of what we now call sexuality studies, which fell under the umbrella of psychology and psychiatry in its infancy. So when people talk about homosexuality in the early church or in the Bible, or so some people use the word in a positive sense. So people who are more open to sexual diversity will talk about homosexuality in the early church in a positive use of that word, and those who are opposed to any kind of discussion of sexual and gender diversity in Christian life will use that word in a very negative sense, in the sense that the Holy Tradition has always condemned homosexuality. Right. Well, that's a stretch. It's a stretch linguistically. It's a stretch culturally. The word did not exist until 170 years ago, and the concept did not exist until 170 years ago. So, with that being said, I usually, when I'm speaking or writing in a theological context, I usually try to avoid the word homosexual, and I usually try to avoid the word gay, because in our own day, these are really heavily laden social constructions. You tell somebody you're gay, and whether the person you're speaking to is an affirming person or not an affirming person, just by saying I'm gay, they just form all kinds of conclusions about you that might not be true. You might not go to Pride. You might not be bed hopping. You might not be engaging in three ways. So all of those things that are kind of stereotypically associated with being gay. So usually when I'm speaking or writing in a theological vein, I try to stick with words, and now no words are going to be perfect,
Yeah.
But I try to stick with things that are a little less culturally laden and socially laden, So I try to use like same-sex love, same-sex orientation, and I am always careful to point out what all gay people know. And I think those who are accepting of gay people probably know this to some degree. But sexual orientation, same-sex orientation, well, any sexual orientation, but same-sex orientation is not exclusively, and maybe not even primarily, a desire to have sex with somebody. But it's an orientation, and this is one of the beauties of reading Florensky, who is, so most of my followers know that I'm doing a PhD thesis on the chapter in The Pillar and Ground of the Truth called Friendship, which is his theology of same-sex love. And the beauty of Florensky's approach is that he articulates the attraction that men can have for each other in a way that prioritizes the spiritual attraction and the intellectual attraction, much in the same way Plato did, like 300-400 years before Christ, So just as Plato didn't deny the physical attraction, he prioritized the spiritual attraction and the emotional attraction, the intellectual attraction, and so it might sound like I'm talking all over the place here, but
no, it's okay. I think it's good to define these terms up front, though, and talk about some of the stuff.
I will eventually get to your question.
Yeah, it's okay.
So
Pavel Florensky.
I've kind of lost my train of thought.
Yeah, don't worry. Yeah, so what you were on Pavel.
So if we look at same-sex orientation as not just a physical or sexual attraction, without denying that aspect of it, but if we see it as a primarily spiritual attraction, emotional attraction, or orientation might be a better word, like spiritually oriented to someone of your own gender or the opposite gender, like emotionally oriented toward someone of your own gender or the opposite gender. We prioritize these over the sexual dimension of the orientation without denying the sexual orientation. And so with that being said, the church has always recognized, not only recognized, but accepted, and not only accepted, but blessed the fact that a significant percentage of human beings, and therefore a significant percentage of people in the church, for whatever reasons they thought were the reason, for whatever we in hindsight think might have been the reasons, a significant percentage of people in the church, both male and female, are simply not suited to opposite-sex marriage and having a family. And the primary way we bless that, and have always blessed that in the Orthodox Church, is monasticism. So we, I do this a little bit myself, but I in my own thinking, I try to balance this. So we have our idealized explanation of why somebody would run off to the desert and become a monk, and we have our hagiographical understanding of why somebody would run off to the desert to become a monk. But I think human nature being what it is, we have to acknowledge that there must have also been psychological reasons, social reasons, there have always been men who just can't imagine being with a woman sexually, and there have always been women who just cannot imagine being with a man sexually. And if you read the Desert Fathers, we often, so many of the anecdotes in the Desert Fathers start off with one Abba said to another, or there were two Abbas. And that opening line never struck me as particularly significant until I read Claudia Rapp's study of brother making, in which she corrects the many errors that John Boswell made in his study of brother making. Claudia Rapp, I think her book was published maybe, let me think. I would say in the last 6, 7, 8 years, Claudia Rapp's book came out, and what she highlighted is that very unlike Western monasticism. The Western monasticism has always been suspicious of what they call particular friendships between two monks.
Well, if I may, though, I was just going to say, even within that, as I study the Latin Church's history, I find a lot of these figures who are held up, like Erasmus or Anselm, they often have had what seem to be same-sex experiences that perhaps may have terrified them later on in their life, but they still seem to have had those kind of things in monastic orders and things in their formative period. But yeah, sorry.
Right. But at least in principle, Western monasticism has tended to be suspicious of and even forbid what they call particular friendships. Well, Claudia Rapp in her book brings attention to the fact that in both Byzantine and Coptic monasticism, monastic couples were quite common. And now, obviously, I don't mean couples in the sense of she calls them monastic pairs, and she probably uses that expression deliberately. And I call them monastic couples, not to suggest that there was anything unseemly going on between them sexually, but to emphasize that it was an exclusive commitment to each other. And oftentimes coupled monks were buried together, not side by side in separate graves, but on top of each other in the same grave. In some of the hagiographical literature, one monk would die and the other one would be so disconsolate that within a few hours or a couple of days, he also died. And then they were buried together in the same pit. So when I read her presentation of what I'm calling monastic couples, it kind of shed a whole new light for me on the Desert Fathers themselves. When a story or an anecdote in the Desert Fathers begins, there were two Abbas, I think we can safely assume that we're talking about a pair of monks who were personally committed to each other and probably shared a cell. Um, so in the Desert Fathers, we find a very, very, it's taken for granted, so same-sex attraction between men is simply taken for granted in the Desert Fathers. I think in more than one of the anecdotes, in more than one of the fathers, we have them lamenting the fact that boys were the destruction of Scetus. And here we have, so we know that in Plato's time, when same-sex relations were socially acceptable and socially institutionalized, by institutionalized, I mean, you know what I mean, given a socially acceptable institutional form, whether it makes us feel squeamish or not, the fact of the matter is that in Plato's, in Symposium, in Phaedrus, and Lysis, which are his three main dialogues pertaining to same-sex love, we're talking about adult men being attracted by the beauty of what we would call teenagers, like the physical beauty of teenage boys. And so this kind of, whether however we want to look at that morally, and of course we have our modern abhorrence of pedophilia, and so I'm not making a moral statement on
the age difference. It's
Plato's time, because I think we have to be careful. When we're studying history, especially ancient history, I think we have to be careful not to project too much of our own moral positionality on a culture where that simply wasn't relevant. So when we get to the Desert Fathers, like 800 years after Plato, we still have this dynamic going on. I suddenly got louder. Am I too loud for you?
No, it seems the same to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. The monks at Scetus, so Scetus was a region in Egypt where a lot of these, there were some Cenobitic monasteries, there were semi-anchorites, semi-hermits, and then there were actual hermits.
I did hear that one. I don't know what that was.
Is that something wrong with my microphone, do you think?
I have no idea what it was, but I think it was the microphone. Is there a fan or something nearby it, or I don't know. So it's been okay so far, though.
Okay, so the Desert Fathers simply take for granted the temptation of same-sex eroticism, and if somebody were to say, "Aha," even they recognize it was sinful. Well, they're monks. They're monks who are committed to a life of sexual abstinence and to the development of their spiritual faculties, which can only happen within a committed life of sexual abstinence.
That's strange, yeah. I don't know what's happening there. Your volume popped up.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's I'm not sure what it is. Have you got some kind of control over the output? Or?
I've got a volume control. Is this better?
Is that no? I think that's just changing the volume that you're hearing, but not the outputted volume.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think that does anything.
Well, when I turned it down, all of that loudness disappeared. Can you still hear me the same?
Yeah, I still hear you the same, even when you go up or down. Yeah,
okay.
So I think it.
Well, I just turned it down a bit, so maybe that would do it. So anyway, what I'm trying to say, if somebody says, aha, even the Desert Fathers recognize that homosexuality was sinful. Well, for the Desert Fathers, heterosexuality was just as sinful. We have several incidents from both the Desert Fathers and the Spiritual Meadow by St. John Moscus, which is similar to the Desert Fathers, but from a slightly different area in that part of the world. We have many episodes of monks just getting fed up with their sexually abstinent lives, and they go to the city and have sex with a woman.
Right.
You know, the interesting thing, though, is that it was considered preferable to stay among the monks where you might be tempted by your fellow monks than to go to the city and have sex with a woman. So I'm not trying to say that the Desert Fathers were somehow pro-gay, pro-homosexual,
Right.
but they didn't regard same-sex temptation with any particular disgust or abhorrence, or so this modern homophobia, where people are just disgusted, like absolutely disgusted by gay people, or the thought that two people of the same gender could do anything sexual with each other. They're not going to find any support for that in reading the Desert Fathers. It was accepted as a daily reality of life that some of the monks might be sexually attracted to some of the other monks, and they dealt with it as best they could. So like I said at the beginning of this part of my answer, I apologize.
No, it's all right. Don't worry. I've got a good idea of where to go next from here. So
I'm incapable of giving short answers. So at the beginning of this section, more than one Desert Father lamented the fact that young boys were the ruination of Scetus, and there was a rule that a young man could not become a monk until he had at least the beginnings of a beard.
Right. Okay.
Because the androgyny of an unbearded boy was too much of a temptation.
Right.
And so there was this rule initially that a young man could not become a monk until he had at least begun to grow a beard. But then at some point in the history of the desert monasticism, that rule was relaxed, and they started admitting beautiful boys. And according to a couple of Desert Fathers, that was the ruination of Scetus, because the older monks couldn't resist the physical beauty of these boys who hadn't yet begun to grow facial hair and stuff like that. There's another anecdote in the Desert Fathers where an older monk, an Abba, is marveling over the chastity of two younger monks. And we get the impression, in light of what Rapp revealed in her book about monastic couples, we get the impression that these two young monks were a pair. And one of the Abbas marveled over the fact that he said to his fellow elder monks, come, look at such purity. They sleep on the same mat without sinning.
Right.
So there's... my favorite, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit because it's been a couple of years been a couple of years since I read it. Two very, very old Abbas are living together in a cell, so it's one of these monastic pairs or monastic couples that Claudia Rapp talks about. And one of them says to the other, do you know what, Abba? He says, after all these years, you're still a temptation to me. And the other one laughed and said, even now? And I thought that is just so beautiful because they struggled all these years together to remain sexually chaste, sexually abstinent, but they could laugh about it. There wasn't this abhorrence, this disgust that we see in so much modern homophobia.
Well, if I can come in at this point,
sure.
Because I know there's tons to say on each topic, but in the interest of time, I want to kind of take us through a few different things as well. So we've touched on, I suppose, here what the kind of Hellenistic background view was towards things, what the earliest Christians and maybe and especially the monastic orders, what some of their views would have been, and very different from this maybe like the prejudice view that we might see the Westboro Baptist Church or something like that having. And then the question is, how does it come about? How does this modern kind of view come about? How does the homophobia, the translation prejudice of taking like certain English words and putting them in place of Greek words that they don't really they don't really interchangeably relate in that same way because the culture doesn't even have that word. Right. How does that actually come about through the course of Christian history?
Yeah. Okay. I'll move forward a little bit. If we regard, just for the sake of convenience, I'll use the word homosexuality. But I want to reiterate for you and for anybody who's watching us is that we mean homosexuality as predominantly a spiritual, emotional, intellectual orientation that has a physical or sexual component, and because of let's be honest, because of our fallen human nature, often the sexual within individual persons, and often the sexual predominates.
But you're using that for heterosexual couples as well. You don't mean sinful nature as in right. right.
I mean the sinful nature of everyone. Yeah. So in a heterosexual context, opposite sex orientation also ideally is primarily spiritual, emotional, intellectual, and then it's expressed in some bodily form. But we all know that there are guys and women who go bar hopping and try to find somebody different to take home for sex every night or every weekend. And so yes, when I say our fallen human nature, I'm not referring to gay people. I'm referring to everybody. So regardless of our sexual orientation, whether it's hetero, homo, or bi, because of our fallenness, one of our struggles as Christians striving to live a life in Christ is to put everything in proper balance. So if we regard homosexuality, and I think some of our viewers might take issue with me if I say this, if we regard homosexuality as ideally a spiritual and emotional orientation, we find that the fathers, particularly the Greek fathers, and just for the sake of anybody who's not familiar with that expression, when we say the fathers, we're referring to like the first 700-800 years of the church's life. So the first millennium of the church's life. That's kind of an arbitrary, artificial cutoff, but conventionally, that's what we mean when we say the fathers. So the fathers wrote very little about marriage. The only one who wrote overwhelmingly positively about marriage was, ironically, St. John Chrysostom. The other fathers who mentioned marriage, and which isn't very many of them, kind of mentioned it almost begrudgingly sometimes. I mean, St. Maximus the Confessor, I did an intense reading course on him a few years ago, and I was really surprised to find that St. Maximus the Confessor is just as negative about marriage and, well, about marital sex as St. Augustine is reputed to have been. So what I was going to say is, though we find relatively little mention of marriage among the fathers overall, we find an awful lot of ink was spent writing about friendship. And we have to understand friendship in the same way that Florensky understood it in 1914, and the same way that Plato understood it 300 or 400 years before Christ, whenever he lived. We're not talking about a guy who has a bunch of friends. We're not talking about a guy and his buddies, or even a guy and his buddy. When the fathers talk about friendship, they're talking about a unique relationship with one other male person. And so when we read their prolific encomiums on friendship, it's really uncomfortable reading in a heterosexist. For someone with a heterosexist mindset, it's really uncomfortable reading. I mean, because most of the fathers were monks, and many of them were bishops or priests, and so they're not admitting any physical sexual component into their idea of friendship, but by modern standards, it's really romantic. Like the way they talk about each other. The letters that they write to each other, the eulogies that they delivered for one another when one of them died, it by our standards is just shockingly romantic.
Right.
So the reason I bring this up is because I think it partly answers your question about what did the church from early times do with homosexuality, and so my position is that one of the things that the church did was spiritualize it by monasticism started off almost as a resistance movement in the church, and kind of it almost became sectarian. It was largely through the efforts of St. Basil the Great that monasticism was embraced by the church and made part of the church instead of some breakaway sect. And so the orientation to be among your own gender has been blessed by the church from the beginning in monasticism, and also in the writings of individual church fathers in their writings on friendship. Now, this is not to say that John Boswell. I think John Boswell is useful because he raises a lot of questions. He's not particularly good at answering the questions that he raises, but he has been extraordinarily useful in bringing certain themes and ideas and topics to the fore that we now need to deal with. And people have said that I'm a 100% Boswell fan. Oh, that is absolutely couldn't be further from the truth. Like when I read Boswell, from beginning to end, I could see all the holes in his research. But anyway, I think it's been many years since I've read his. So I think his first book is called something like "Gay People in." Okay. The one that you finished reading recently.
Oh, that's called Homosexuality and Christian Social Change, or something to that effect.
Okay. It's been many years since I've read that. I've worked with his same-sex unions in pre-modern Europe. I've worked with that much more recently, and so I have a better recall of that. But I understand emotionally and psychologically why a modern gay person would want to do this, but if you're a scholar, you really have to rein yourself in and kind of control your wishful thinking and see what is actually there in the historical record and not what you wish was there in the historical record. So at no point do I think historically can we say Well, the church used to condone, or the church at least used to tolerate, sex between two people of the same gender. I mean, the church has always condoned love between two people of the same gender, even exclusive, committed love between two persons of the same gender. But we find no historical evidence that sex within such a relationship was ever condoned or tolerated. As a matter of fact, so Saint Justinian, Emperor Justinian, he's the emperor behind Hagia Sophia, and he was also a fine theologian. The second half of the second antiphon at every divine liturgy is traditionally attributed to Justinian for its authorship. For any Orthodox who are listening to us, that would be Only Begotten Son, which is the second part of the second antiphon, is traditionally attributed to Justinian. So, everybody loves Saint Justinian because he built Hagia Sophia, and he was such a good theologian that he even wrote this deeply, deeply theological hymn. But on the other hand, Justinian's code, his code of laws, were brutal against men who were caught engaging in sexual activity with each other. So there's that. The canons of the seven ecumenical councils. It's kind of commonplace and laziness to say that the canons forbid this or the canons forbid that,
Right.
In terms of personal behavior, and especially in terms of sexual behavior. I mean, you could probably make that inference that the canons forbid this, that, and the other thing. But what the canons actually do is they provide penances
Right.
for people who have done these things. And that would presuppose, in my mind, that would presuppose that someone has confessed the thing. I mean, how does a priest or a bishop impose a penance on someone if the person hasn't come forward in confession and said, I did this, that, or the other thing? Or if sometimes sins are publicly known. And so same-sex acts, like I really hate that designation, but homosexual acts are penanced in the canons of the ecumenical councils. But if my memory serves me right, it wasn't until the Fifth Ecumenical Council, and we're talking about late 6th century now, it wasn't until the sixth, the Fifth Ecumenical Council dealt with monothelitism, the heresy that Christ incarnate only had one will instead of two wills, and then the Quinisext, which means 5-6, which is the Sixth Ecumenical Council, largely did not deal with dogma, but with the canons that the Fifth Council didn't have time to get around to. If I remember correctly, sexual behavior did not begin to be regulated by ecumenical councils until the Sixth Ecumenical Council. So we're talking quite late in the first millennium of the church's history. And all of a sudden, there's a multiplication of canons applying penances to sexual sins. But it's important to note that not just homosexual sins, but also heterosexual sins. And it's also important to note that the canons don't express any particular disgust or abhorrence with homosexual sins. It's just, if somebody has done this, and penance in those times usually involved what we would call a temporary excommunication. So if somebody has done this, let him not have communion for such a period of time. And then if he's repentant, let him come back. So that's typically how the canons are structured with regard to personal behavior. So So homosexual sins are treated just as matter-of-factly as heterosexual sins in the language that's used in the canons, and they are treated no more severely. So the penance for homosexual sin is no more severe than heterosexual sin, and in some cases it's even less severe. The canons, the penance for homosexual sin in some cases is even less severe than for heterosexual sins. But these they're kind of like, I think if we're going to be honest with ourselves, the canons are kind of like Leviticus. Right. Leviticus says, if a man lies with a man as with a woman, it's an abomination to the Lord. Let them both be stoned. Well, the text itself gives absolutely no context for that statement, and as everybody knows, Leviticus names an awful lot of other things as abomination to the Lord for which people should be put to death. That we pay absolutely no attention to. And so these canons, now some people interpret the canons to mean in every instance, these sexual acts are sinful. And I can see, to be honest, I can see where a person could make that inference or reach that conclusion. That in every single instant, these sins, these acts are sinful and need to be penanced. But canons in the Orthodox Church don't have the same function as canon law in the Roman Church. The word canon in Greek literally means a yardstick or a measuring stick. And so in an Orthodox mindset, the canons aren't rigid, inflexible, juridical, legalistic kind of laws, but they're guidelines for priests and bishops in the execution of their pastoral duties. And many of the canons, and that's not just a modern, or postmodern historical revisionism of the meaning of the canon. The canons themselves, it's built right into the canon. Many times, the canons themselves say, let the person be penanced, which means excommunicated for 10 years. But if he's sincerely repentant, let that term be reduced, and according to the discretion of the priest or the bishop, let there be no penance. Meaning that a person could confess a very serious sin, and if the bishop or the priest hearing the confession deemed the repentance and the remorse sincere enough, that person could be admitted back to communion immediately. So I don't know.
Yeah, don't worry. I can. Yeah. So the original thread is, I suppose, what's the story about how we get to. So we've got part of the way there, I think. But right. I think I want to try and get out the full story about how we see the present prejudices that we see today. So we've got up to a point where there doesn't seem to be that much more prejudice than there is for heterosexual couples who do whereas today we sort of see I don't know, I think we see a difference in how people would view. I mean, most American evangelicals, for example, wouldn't be okay with people just kind of dating around, sleeping around as a heterosexual couple, but they certainly have more of a bias, as it were, against people who are of the same sex who are doing that kind of thing. It's like it's extra wrong or something. It's like, where does that come from? How does that attitude?
Let me just affirm what you just said. Back in 2016, I was I was attending the Russian Cathedral in Toronto for about 4 years, and the people loved me. My father confessor loved me, and the other priest, who was not my father confessor, except when the first priest wasn't there, he loved me, and I mean I was very well loved at this parish until one of the glassy-eyed young zealots in the parish started making a row over my MA thesis, and started demanding that the priest do something with me because of the MA thesis I had written. So, this first came to my attention on Holy Thursday of 2016, and on the morning of Bright Tuesday, just 5 days later, so that would be like Tuesday of Easter week in Western parlance. So in 5 days, I went from being aware that this person was making an issue of my MA thesis to being excommunicated from the parish, and then the bishop of the diocese ratified the excommunication, meaning that I can't have communion in any local or parish in Canada because of an MA thesis I wrote. In affirming what you just said is that this kind of wink attitude toward heterosexual premarital sex. The younger priest at the parish, who was my main pole, I really think my father confessor, who was the senior priest, would have just let it go. And maybe just asked me not to talk about my thesis anymore in the parish, which I generally didn't do. I only discussed it with like 2 people who specifically asked me what my thesis was about. But the younger priest was a bit of a zealot, a bit of a fanatic. Even the older priest characterized him as a zealot whose zealotry never ends well. But that younger priest, he was just furious with me, and he went overnight from loving me to being thoroughly disgusted with me, and within that 5-day period, he approached me several times in church to holler at me, which I go to church to pray and worship, not to be hollered at. But to get to the point you just made. He said it's okay when guys and girls are having sex before marriage because we can talk them into getting married. It's like, whoa,
because that's much better, right? Just force people into getting married.
Yes. I mean, your video from last year.
Someone with a similar attitude, I think.
Right. You talked, and the reason I bring it up is because it's a public video of yours.
Yeah.
You talked about your experience of evangelical Christianity, where you were given an ultimatum: either break up with your girlfriend or get married right now. Well, it doesn't always work out that way. So I can tell you. So most of my research for my PhD thesis has to do with the situation in Russia in the 19th century into the early 20th century. So I can tell you that what a lot of people don't, especially pious people, like pious people who think of Holy Mother Russia, and they think of, that Russia consisted of holy peasants walking around making the sign of the cross and saying the Jesus prayer all day long. They read the Way of the Pilgrim, and they think that characterizes all of Russia, or at least all of rural Russia. I mean, scholars certainly know this, but the pious Orthodox faithful who haven't done much scholarly reading are not always aware that Russia was by the 19th century, and especially toward the end of the 19th century, Russia was absolutely part of the West. Culturally, philosophically. The educated classes in Russia were absolutely involved in the philosophical and cultural and literary movements of Western Europe. Now, to their credit, they didn't want to be mere copycats of the West. They wanted to bring their uniquely Russian perspective, their uniquely Russian way of thinking to the same questions that Western Europe was dealing with at the time. And one of the foremost of these was sexuality and gender. Like this was the era of Oscar Wilde. This was the early career of André Gide. Like a lot of people haven't heard of Gide, but he's kind of the French version of Oscar Wilde, with the exception that he never got into any kind of legal trouble the way Oscar Wilde did. And this is the era where we have, if we want to use the word gay anachronistically, this is the Victorian. We think of the Victorian era as this era of moral purity, and of course Michel Foucault has done a lot to dismantle that myth, especially in his chapter of the other Victorians. You're familiar with that?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
I've not read much on this topic or Russian history and Christianity.
No, Foucault is in France.
Well, sorry. Even in the continental tradition of philosophy itself, I'm pretty ignorant of most of that stuff, to be honest.
Oh, okay. But then, anyway,
people just start talking about Hegel, and I just sort of it gets a bit crazy.
Foucault is a near contemporary of ours. I think he died in the 1970s.
Right. Okay. And I know he appraised the Boswell book, but I don't know much.
He did what?
He appraised the Boswell book that I've been reading.
Okay.
His appraisal is written on that, and then I know I only really hear him mentioned by people like Jordan Peterson, who also the postmodernists who have ruined the West. Michel Foucault, he'll say, obviously it's people like Foucault.
Yeah.
That's something better than his.
I think people need to understand that if we admire a scholar or a philosopher or a cultural figure, it doesn't necessarily mean that we agree with everything he says. It just means that we admire him as a great intellectual, an honest intellectual. So anyway, Foucault is most known, at least in the circles I've been studying in for the past 10 years, since I went back to school. Foucault is most known for his history of sexuality. Right. And I don't remember if the first or second chapter in this history. It's called The Other Victorians. And he completely dismantles the myth that Victorian people were all these lily pure moral people. And so the era that he's talking about, the Victorian era, is the era of Oscar Wilde, as I already said. We have Henry Scott Tuke. Do you know that name?
Nope, never heard of it.
Okay, Henry Tuke, Tuke.
I might have. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I have. I think I'm thinking of The Hobbit or something. Well, I'm thinking of Tuke. Tuke was someone's surname in The Hobbit, which the.
To use a modern term anachronistically, Tuke was gay, and he was a painter, like a prominent British painter. And what did he paint? He painted pictures of naked boys on the beach, naked boys diving off of rocks, naked boys climbing in and out of rowboats, and some of his paintings, like there's one in particular where one of the boys, but it's very tasteful. He doesn't focus microscopically on the genitals of these boys. When you look at the paintings, the overall impression that the viewer gets is a beautiful naked body, without any unnecessary attention to the genitals. But in one painting in particular, you've got one boy stretched out on his back on the sand, probably dozing, and another boy standing next to him looking right at him. So it's like, so he's not looking at the seagulls or the waves coming in. He's looking straight at his friend's body. And then we also have from Germany during the same era, Wilhelm von Gludow, Gludow. Again, to use an anachronism, he was gay. Victoria, a very well-known photographer in Victoria, from Germany, and most of his work is photographs of naked boys in Sicily. So it's interesting that even now, the city of Taormina in Sicily is considered to be a gay mecca. Back in the 19th century, that's where von Gludow went to do it. And what he did is he got local boys to pose for him, but they were, what he got them to do was to pose in classical positions. So it was like he was imagining life in classical Greece and getting them to, and sometimes they wore laurels on their head. He made a makeup from flour and milk, and so if any of these boys had blemishes on their body, he would cover them up with this mixture of so my point being is that I think I started off by saying that Russia at the time, the latter half of the 19th century, the beginning years of the 20th century, at least the intellectual classes and the educated classes in Russia were in lockstep with Western Europe in the things that interested them. The cultural, the political, the literary things that interested them, although not in lockstep, as I said a little while ago, as copycats, but as wanting to make a unique Russian contribution to the same things that Western Europe was dealing with, and so I'm giving you this picture of the high awareness of sexuality and particularly homosexuality in Western Europe at the time, which was so in Russia, in the secular sphere, this was a time, the whole 19th century, but particularly the latter half of the 19th century, was a time where what we would call non-normative sex or non-normative sexuality. Right. This was a time when these questions were vigorously debated in jurisprudence, vigorously debated in. There were medical and psychological conferences, psychiatric conferences going on in Russia, where they were talking about homosexuality. There was some relaxation of Russian law regarding same-sex acts. Some of the debaters in the legal sphere advocated for a complete decriminalization of same-sex acts, as many countries in Western Europe had already adopted. That initiative failed. So in the declining years, or the declining decades, rather, of Tsarist Russia, they failed to decriminalize same-sex acts, but they significantly relaxed the penalties for same-sex acts, as long as they were consensual same-sex acts. But then we have, as the main focus of my doctoral dissertation, we have Florensky appearing on the scene, who, by all counts, was what we would now call gay. And even though he did end up getting married and having 5 children over 13 years. I also got married and had 5 children over 13 years. So, so we have him in a relationship with his seminary roommate for 5 or 6 years. 2 or 3 years into that relationship, he starts writing Friendship. As the spiritual and the theological apologetic, so to speak. I know you like to use that word a lot in your videos. So Friendship, which is the culminating chapter of the Pillar and Ground of the Truth, stands as Florensky's theological and spiritual apologetic for the kind of relationship he was currently in when he started writing it. What makes it all the more significant is that when he finally published it as a book, his partner, Sergei Troitsky, was 4 years dead. Florensky was 4 years married, 3 years an ordained priest, and their first child was 3 years old. So the birth of his first child and his ordination to the priesthood occurred within a couple of months of each other. And this is when he publishes his book without making any changes. So he didn't, like if we can kind of speculate on what was going on, he didn't say, well, I'm a married man now, so I have to replace Friendship with a chapter called Marriage.
Right.
He left Friendship as the culminating chapter of his book. As a matter of fact, the book, in a couple of places, devalues marriage. It calls marriage kind of a vestige from paganism that the church kind of incorporated into its life, and not only that, but the dedication to the book, which is called Two Worlds, is dedicated to his deceased partner, his deceased same-sex partner. So not only did he not replace Friendship with a chapter called Marriage, he didn't replace the dedication with a dedication to his wife. And what makes it all the more astounding is that so he's married and has a child, and in his dedication, he doesn't name Sergei, but biographers and historians know that that's who he was addressing, or whom he was addressing. So he's married and has a child, and he's an ordained priest, and he's saying to Sergei, without naming him, "You are not here, and I am all alone in the whole world." It's really, I can never talk about that. The dedication is only 3 or 4 pages long, and I can never talk about it without tearing up myself, because the very last sentence of his dedication is, let me find it so I don't want to paraphrase. I want to. In the very last sentence of his dedication, he says to Sergei, "And I, after all, am nothing more than a pupil who repeats after you the lessons of love." And like I said, he's 4 years married and 4 years priest. 3 years a priest. 4 years married and 3 years a priest, and 3 years the father of his first child when this book went to press. So I'll stop and I'll let you direct the conversation in whatever direction you want to take it, because I don't think I have anything. Well, let me just conclude with this briefly. That so I turn 66 the day after tomorrow. So I've been around the block. I've been around the sun a few times, and I've I've been around the block a few times as an Orthodox Christian, and I have never in my life seen anything like, well, the culture wars in general, but the culture wars in the Orthodox Church.
Right.
They're just, you know what, if 30 or 40 years ago I had said to somebody, wherever I was attending parish at the time, attending church at the time, I've never attended an all convert parish, and I count that as a blessing. I've attended mostly what we call ethnic parishes, and sometimes we use that as a pejorative. Oh, that's just an ethnic parish, but maybe they're worshiping in a language that you don't completely understand. And yeah, maybe they have Greek dancing or Serbian dancing every Thursday for the kids. But the beauty of an ethnic parish is that you're getting to know and love and become brothers and sisters with ordinary Orthodox people who have not only been Orthodox all their life, but whose ancestors have been Orthodox for generations, if not a millennium. If I had said 30 or 40 years ago to somebody in a Serbian parish or somebody in a Greek parish or a Romanian parish, you know what? I've discovered that this Russian priest back in 1914 published a Theology of Same-Sex Love, and I'm going to do my doctoral research on that. Some people would have said, yeah, most people would have said, oh, that's nice. And, some people would have said, oh, really? But even the people who would have said, oh, really? It would have ended there. We would be at the coffee hour. I mean, every church in the world has a coffee hour after the Sunday liturgy. And it's, so any conversations like this would take place at the coffee hour. And So if I had said something like that, even the ones who looked a little bit askance at me and said, oh, really? In the next instant, we go back to drinking our coffee and talking about something else. So what we're seeing now in the 21st century is the culture wars being not just unconsciously or subconsciously adopted or enlisted in would be a better by many Orthodox Christians, but consciously. I mean, there are priests who mark themselves as culture warriors.
Oh, yeah, I know there's a big Eastern Orthodox guy called Jay Dyer, and I wouldn't even. I find it even bizarre that he's a Christian, because it mostly seems to be almost like he seems to be like a caricature of.
Who are we talking about?
An Eastern Orthodox guy called Jay Dyer, who's quite big on YouTube, who's really involved in the culture war type stuff.
Right.
And at first I found it weird that he was.
I've heard of him, and I have to admit I've avoided.
Yeah, but I've just found it I found it even difficult. At first I was like, wait, hang on, he's a Christian? Because he seemed like a caricature of all this culture war stuff. Yeah. When I first started listening to some of the, I thought he was just a political figure from America or something, and not. But yeah, sorry.
Well, so in Orthodoxy, maybe this is true outside of Orthodoxy, but in Orthodoxy, the culture wars take place on the internet.
Right.
Where I go to church, and I won't say where I go to church because too many people online have threatened me that if they can find out where I go to church, they'll make trouble with that bishop to get me excommunicated. So I never say publicly where I go to church. But where I go to church, the only people who know who I am, so to speak, like Giacomo of Orthodoxy and Dialogue, Giacomo of that perverted reading of Florensky. The only person. So I go to two churches. I kind of alternate between two churches with both priests, knowing that sometimes I'm at this church and sometimes that. Both of them, the priests know who I am in terms of my public persona, which I kind of embarrassed to talk about myself that way, but somebody else told me I was a public figure. So everybody else, literally every single other person in this parish, just sees me as that that middle-aged guy with the long hair who comes to church and prays and has communion and smiles and says hello to everybody and then leaves. And so when people, I think you've probably seen on my Twitter that more and more people come to me privately who are queer and Orthodox, or queer ally and Orthodox, or queer or allies and wanting to become Orthodox. They come to me privately either by direct messaging on Twitter or by email to my Orthodoxian Dialogue email account. On a few occasions, I've arranged, or the person and I have arranged, a Zoom call with each other, or a telephone call with each other, which I'm always open. If somebody comes with good intention, I'm always open to Zooming or talking on the phone with somebody who needs help. And the thing, especially if it's an inquirer, somebody, what's really, really tragic is that you might have some gay person or some transgender person suddenly fall upon the fathers. They discover the fathers, and they feel like the fathers' interpretation of Scripture. They feel themselves just coming to life in a way that Christianity never made them feel before. Like in your public video that I just mentioned a little while ago, you experience Christianity as, if I can paraphrase you, as kind of an increasingly suffocating environment. So I have gay people, transgender people, they start to read the fathers and they're like, oh my gosh, this is Christianity? Where is it? Where is it today? Where can I find it? And then they do a little bit more research and they find out that it's the Orthodox Church. It's the Orthodox Church that is in a continuous genealogical line back to the fathers, and even before the fathers back to Pentecost. And then when they excitedly discover that the Orthodox Church is the Church of the Fathers, then tragedy hits when they start Googling contemporary Orthodoxy, and they discover certain priests whose names I won't mention here, but anybody who reads Orthodoxy and Dialogue knows who I'm talking about. They find certain priests who just devastate these young queer inquirers who found life in the fathers, and now they're finding some of the figures in our own time who have custody of that tradition.
Right.
So if it's an inquirer, the first thing I do is reassure them that that's all internet stuff. Unless you go to the parish of such and such priest or such and such other priest, unless you go to their parish, if you just go to any random normal Orthodox parish, you might not find a priest who's the greatest theologian in the world, but you're certainly going to find a priest who isn't a culture warrior and isn't even interested in the culture wars, and who is a good-hearted pastor, even if some of his pastoral practice you don't completely agree with. In most normal Orthodox parishes, you're not going to find the priesthood occupied by a monster. I think in some of your past videos and in some of the conversation you and I have had prior to today's interview, you've talked about spiritual trauma, and that's a very real thing. I mean, not to turn this into a pity party, but I'm living through an endless fog of spiritual trauma, even because of the sheer hatred of my Orthodox brothers and sisters and fathers who hate so much what I'm doing that they hate me personally, passionately. I've had people, like I told you, I won't repeat those words here, but like I told you before we opened up the interview, I have been called every single most obscene name in the book that you can think to call a gay man on social media for the rest of the world to see. Some of them take the trouble to email me, Orthodoxy in Dialogues, to tell me in an email all these horrible names. And I have had people tell me, I can't wait to see you burn in hell.
Right.
Like, wait a minute. Like, where do you get that in Orthodox tradition? Orthodox spirituality has taught me over a lifetime to regard myself as the first among sinners. Now, the first time I said that prayer, so it's part of one of our prayers before communion. I believe, O Lord, and I confess that thou art truly the Christ, the Son of the living God, who came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am first. And this obviously is a paraphrase of St. Paul. The first time I read that prayer, I still chuckle when I think back on my young self, because the first time I read that prayer, I thought, I can think of a dozen people right now who are much worse than I am. But as you grow older in the faith and as you mature in the faith, you really become to understand that on a deep level that transcends any kind of rationalistic taxonomy of who's more sinful and who's less sinful. I mean, you can't get through the first few prayers in the Orthodox prayer book without saying, I'm the first among sinners. No one has committed the sins that I've committed. No one has done the things that I've done. I'm worse than the harlot. I'm even worse than Paul when he was murdering the church. Like cast off rags is my so-called righteousness. So I don't know how anybody who claims to be Orthodox, and who presumably, even if they're not reading these prayers every day, presumably they've read them a few times in the course, or now and then in the course of their Orthodox life. How can you immerse yourself in these prayers, or the prayer of Saint Ephrem the Syrian, which we say 1,000 times during Great Lent? It ends with, Yea, O Lord and King, grant me to see my own transgressions and not to judge my brother. Any church-going Orthodox Christian says that prayer hundreds of times during Great Lent. How can you be immersed in this and then turn around and say to a brother, or anybody, let alone a brother Orthodox, I can't wait to see you burn in hell? Because what Orthodox spirituality teaches me is that if there's one man left in hell, it's going to be me. In the wild debates going on right now in Orthodox circles about universal salvation, like is universal salvation something we hope for, or something we pray for, or is it something that will inevitably happen? My position on that is, if I'm saved, then yes, there is universal salvation. Because it's unimaginable to me that someone would be in hell if I'm not there also, because I am the first among sinners. So going back to, I think, spiritual trauma, growing numbers of people who are familiar with me because of Orthodoxy and Dialogue, growing numbers of people turn to me for healing, and I say that in complete humility because I'm really nothing, and I'm really a nobody, and if I am able to help someone navigate their difficulties, it's only by the grace of God. Not because there's anything special about me, but in growing numbers, Orthodox people come to me who have been spiritually traumatized by this priest or that priest, um, and inquirers who are kind of indirectly traumatized. Like I said earlier, they read the fathers, they think, oh my gosh, this is life, this is light. And then they trace the fathers to the contemporary Orthodox Church, and then they find some of our priests are spiritual traumatizers, spiritual abusers, and so the inquirers are kind of indirectly spiritually traumatized. They think, yes, Orthodoxy is what I've been looking for, and then they discover Father so and so over here, or Father so and so on the other coast. I figure, if someone comes to me, the Lord has sent them to me in my unworthiness, in my sinfulness. And I welcome each and every one into my heart. I welcome each and every one into conversation with me, even if that evolves into talking on the phone or talking by Zoom. And by the grace of God, everybody who has come to me so far has felt a lightening of their burden. I'm not suggesting that I solve all their problems or have all the answers from them, but I try to be a good listener, and being a good listener doesn't just mean keeping your mouth shut and letting the person say what they have to say. It means listening to them for understanding, not listening to them for ammunition that you can throw back at them. But Christ, so in the one example in the four Gospels of the one unambiguous example of Christ dealing with a habitual sexual sinner, to use modern language, would be the woman at the well of Samaria. He didn't bring her to repentance by yelling and screaming how horrible she was, or how disgusting she was, or how, according to the Old Testament, she was an abomination an abomination in the eyes of God. But God becomes incarnate and reserves his harshest language for whom? You know as well as I do. God incarnate reserves his harshest language for the religious self-righteous and the religious moralizers. In the parable of the publican and the Pharisee, when the Pharisee said, "Thank you, God, for not making me like that guy, because I do this and I do that," he listed all of his the spiritual duties that he fulfilled. He wasn't lying, we should infer that he really did fulfill all those spiritual duties. But what does the gospel say? This is one of my favorite nano verses in the whole New Testament. He prayed with himself. He prayed with himself. It was the man at the back who had nothing more to say but, "Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner." That's who God listened to. So I'm not suggesting that the Orthodox Church or Orthodox people individually should become moral relativists. And yes, whether we like it or not, the Orthodox Church does have standards for who can come and who can't. And standards for, even if you're in, we have standards for who can have communion at any given time and who can't. Now, if people say, that's not Christian. Well, not only have they not read any church history, they've not even read the New Testament. And St. Paul, right in the New Testament, says, "Who cannot have communion?" The case of the man sleeping with his stepmother, throw him out. Did I say communion?
Yeah, you did say communion.
Oh, I'm sorry. The man having sex.
You didn't say communion with. Sorry, yeah, you meant you did. You said who can't take communion. I assumed that was when you said
right. Yeah. So so right in the New Testament we have the man who was having sex with his own stepmother, and St. Paul just throw him out. Have nothing to do with him. So. And as everyone knows, I was a priest myself for a number of years, and there were a few occasions where, with deep sorrow, I had to tell a person that they couldn't have communion for a little while. They couldn't have communion until a couple of conditions had been fulfilled relative to their confession. And but the thing is, so I was 7 years an active priest. In 7 years of hearing confessions constantly in my parishes, I think only 2 or 3 times did I tell someone, I can't give you absolution now. And that means if you're not giving them absolution, that means they can't have communion. So I did that maybe 2 or 3 times in 7 years. I did it with extreme reluctance, extreme sorrow, and I never, ever weaponized it.
Yeah.
Even while I was hearing confessions, I was having this ongoing conversation in my own mind while listening to your confession. I would be saying to myself, who do you think you are? Standing here, listening to someone else's sins. You are the first among sinners, meaning me. I am the first among sinners. What business do I have listening to somebody else's sins, and sometimes having, a couple of times having to withhold communion from that person for a short period of time, when if communion should have been withheld from anybody, it should have been me, because I'm the first among sinners. No one has committed the sins that I have done. So what I find really appalling in the Orthodox version of the culture wars is how quickly and people call for the excommunication of anyone who disagrees with them to the slightest degree. Yep, I don't know if you're aware. I won't give the guy the satisfaction of mentioning his name in this interview, but there's a guy who has a petition going on. I think it's on change.org. He has a petition going to get me excommunicated because of my work on orthodoxy and dialogue. And I will say that, and I mentioned this to you before we started the show, that a few days ago, I defended the need of children and teenagers who already know that they're either gay or lesbian or transgender or queer in some way. I defended their need to know, to have access to information about themselves, obviously age-appropriate information about what it means to be gay, what it means to be transgender, or at least to start thinking that that's what you are, because we all know that childhood and adolescence is a period of intense questioning. So this gentleman who had this never-ending petition to get me excommunicated, which he popped up on, I don't follow him on Twitter, he doesn't follow me on Twitter. He popped up out of nowhere to comment on that tweet of mine and said, nothing new here, that defrocked sodomite is out there sexualizing children again. And then which suggests that he knows why I'm no longer a priest. And I submit that nobody knows why I'm no longer a priest. The only ones who know are the bishops who deposed me, and God. I'm not being facetious when I say that even I don't know why I was deposed from the priesthood. There was one false allegation made against me, which I denied. The person bringing the allegation was persistent enough that the Synod of Bishops of the OCA, Orthodox Church in America, probably felt they had no choice but to just throw me out of the priesthood and be done with it. So this gentleman who has this petition, and he's my brother in Christ. I mean, we're Orthodox, like it doesn't matter if I have communion here and he has communion somewhere in Kentucky or Louisiana, we're still at the same chalice, in the Orthodox Church. No, it doesn't matter where you're having communion, you're still at the same chalice, receiving the same body and blood of Christ. So my brother in Christ, who had the petition going to get me excommunicated, showed up when I was defending queer children and teenagers, saying nothing new here, that defrocked sodomite is out sexualizing children again. And then in his next tweet, he called me pedo, which is short for pedophile. And then one of his followers called me a groomer, meaning someone who grooms children for underage sex. I rather than give either of them any satisfaction, I blocked them both immediately. So I have this sense that when a person has gone through a lot of suffering, one of two results will accrue from that. One of them is that you can turn you into a really bitter person and a cynic. And the other one is that it can soften you. Like intense suffering can soften your heart and soften you toward other people and make you more compassionate toward other people. And for myself, I would say, and when I talk about intense suffering, I'm not just talking about the last couple of years, since these people have crawled out of the woodwork to call me bad names. But I've been on the receiving end of emotional and psychological homophobic abuse since I was 5 years old. So in my case, I strive to be the compassionate, loving sufferer, but I fully confess that I'm not always successful at that. Sometimes this deep well of bitterness and anger and cynicism just wells up inside of me, and by the grace of God, I'm able to beat it back, but it's there. It's there. It's something that I have to acknowledge is there, and so this angry, bitter, cynical side of me is just as much a part of me as the more compassionate, more loving, more listening side of me.
So
I think we've kind of gone off topic, so I'll let you. I'll give it back to you.
Well, it's okay. Well, we've been going for an hour and a half now, so I think we're thinking about wrapping it up around about now. Mitch has said, "Thank you. Great conversation today. I've enjoyed your guest perspective on a rather touchy topic for many Christians. So thank you." And there's been many nice words throughout. Anam said, "You're very brave as well, sharing your story." So yeah, but before we wrap up, I suppose the last thing to maybe mention then would be for people who are Christians who might be listening or have listened to this. What would you say? How do you want them to kind of approach this topic now? I mean, bearing in mind that they might disagree with you, quite vehemently. What would be one piece of advice you want to give them to maybe approach this topic differently?
Okay. I'm going to answer that question by referring to one of your written questions that we didn't have time to get to.
Sure.
So the question that we didn't have time to get to was, so how many people in the Orthodox Church agree with me and how many disagree with me? I can only speak from personal experience. Obviously, I haven't conducted a global survey on these questions. But the people who hate me and hate what I'm doing venomously, I'm convinced are just a handful of people online. But, a handful of bullies with big voices can do an awful lot of harm. My sense is that, I know for a fact, many priests and even a certain number of bishops contact me privately and say, I appreciate so much what you're doing. You're really helping me to understand things in a better light. Keep up the good work. I don't agree with everything you say. And this is important. This is why it's orthodoxy in dialogue. They're careful to say, I don't agree with everything you say, but you're on the right track. The church needs. And so for queer people who are Orthodox or who want to become Orthodox, or for the Orthodox families of queer people, because they're just as spiritually traumatized. Like if you're gay and Father XYZ is spiritually traumatizing you, well, he's also traumatizing your parents and your siblings and your cousins and and like everybody who loves you at home and accepts you with open arms at home are just as much traumatized by Father ABC or Father XYZ as the person himself. So my sense is that the church, with the exception of these really hateful people who I really do believe are in the minority, despite how much noise they make, my sense is that the church is ready for this conversation. And the sad thing about these priests and bishops who reach out to me privately is they apologize to me that they can't speak supportively of me publicly.
Right.
So everybody who follows Orthodoxy in Dialogue knows that there was a priest of one jurisdiction who wrote a very wonderful article for Orthodoxy in Dialogue about pastoring LGBTQ people. And within a day or two, his hierarch, his bishop, canceled his scheduled promotion to a higher honorific rank in the priesthood, and forced him to issue a retraction of the article he had published. There's in a different jurisdiction, there was a proto-deacon, which is kind of the highest honorific title for a deacon. And in another jurisdiction, there was a proto-deacon who wrote an article for Orthodoxy in Dialogue about the need for a better pastoral approach to LGBTQ people in the Orthodox Church. His bishop did not demand that he retract it publicly, but he did order him never to write on that topic again, and never to write on Orthodoxy in Dialogue again. And then there was a priest in the same jurisdiction as that proto-deacon, but under a different local bishop. All he did was, we had a petition, either last year or the year before, we had a petition asking the bishops of the Orthodox Church to explore a more open-minded pastoral approach to LGBTQ people. And this priest signed that petition. His bishop contacted him within a couple of days. What did you mean by signing that petition? Like, what do you think the church should be doing that we're not already doing? And the priest, had his conversation with his bishop, and the bishop was okay with it. But then a few days later, the bishop contacted that priest and demanded that he get his name removed from that petition. Now, at my age, I'm not afraid of bishops. I'm not afraid of priests. I'm not afraid of anybody. So the reason I removed this priest's name from the petition was not out of deference to his bishop, but out of deference to the priest himself, because he and I have become friends. And so in order not to cause any further difficulties between my friend and his bishop, I did remove his name. So with that being said, my point is that there are lots of bishops and priests who support what I'm doing, not to say that they agree with everything that I say, but they support how aggressively I pursue and drive this conversation. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, and I don't say this in pride, because, as I've said before, I'm really a nobody, but I'm a very stubborn, obstinate nobody. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Orthodoxy in Dialogue has unwittingly become, in the almost 4 years of its existence, the main driver of conversation about sexuality and gender in the Orthodox Church. Let me just close with, I know you want to wrap this up, but just to finish off, so there's a priest. There's a priest here in Toronto with whom I am on very friendly terms. I mean, friendly terms to the point where a few times a year after weekday liturgy, he and I will go have lunch together. So it's that kind of friendship. So several years ago, I gave him my MA thesis to read, and if anybody's watching this, down in the written introduction, it refers to my MA thesis. It's called A Bed Undefiled, Foundations for an Orthodox Theological and Spiritual, Foundations for an Orthodox Theology and Spirituality of Same-Sex Love. So that was an MA thesis that I submitted in 2015. So sometime in the year following, I gave it to my friend, my priest friend, to read. I don't think he read it cover to cover, but he did give it a good skimming over to get the general trend of what I was saying and what I'm thinking. And so we're having lunch. He's been a priest for over 30 years. He's a senior priest in his diocese. Not only is he a parish priest, but he also has a position in the administration of the diocese. And he spent his entire priesthood in the same parish. So after we briefly discussed my MA thesis, then he shared with me that because he's been in the same parish, back then it was closer to like 25 years, because he'd been in the same parish his entire priesthood, that the little boys and girls that he baptized as newborn babies were now coming to him to get married.
Right.
And he said, but not all of them. His face just went gray. Right. I have seldom met a more pastoral, more loving priest in all my life in the Orthodox Church. His face just went gray. And he said, but not all of them. He said, some of them are coming to me to come out as gay. And his voice was breaking. And I very gently said, and what do you say to them? And he said to them, now mind you, these are 21, 23, 25-year-olds that he baptized as babies. So they're as much his children as they are children to their biological parents. I said, what do you say to them? And he said, well, I tell them officially, the church says they can't stay. And I said to him, do you feel good when you say that to them? And he put his face right down on the table in the middle of the restaurant and started crying. And he, no, he said, there has to be a better way. There has to be better answers. And I would like to think, maybe I'm being naive, I would like to think that he's not alone in the priesthood. I would like to think that a great many Orthodox priests, and maybe most Orthodox priests, feel just like him. There has to be a better answer. There has to be a better way that the Orthodox Church can minister to LGBTQ people. And so I wanted to say that because, sometimes people who read Orthodox in dialogue through a very narrow lens think I'm anti-bishop and anti-priest. No, I'm only anti-bishops and priests behaving badly, especially behaving badly to people like me. I'm not always, I'm not much interested in defending myself, because the gospel tells me to bear my cross. But I will be an obstinate and stubborn defender of other people, especially people like me.
So Scapegoat Iscariot said, I've been engrossed in the chat and I'll be hearing this again when it's over. I'm in my 50s. This topic means a lot to me. So thanks to the guest for coming on. So there's at least,
wonderful.
Yeah, so there's a few people who I think have really enjoyed listening to the things that you've had to share today. So
any negative messaging coming up?
Only
welcome,
at the start.
Joshua.
At the start, there was some sort of irrelevant negative messaging that was to do with more just to do with like someone not thinking Christianity is true, and it wasn't so much to do with our topic. And then other than that, I mean, someone not so much a negative comment, but just saying that in the Russian Orthodox Church, you wouldn't be able to, you'd get excommunicated for holding these opinions and stuff. I don't think they're saying you should be. They're just, I think, saying that that's how the Russian Orthodox Church is. But other than that, most people have been enjoying it, I think. Spartan Theology says thanks for the conversation. He enjoyed it a lot.
Oh, great, your friend, Spartan Theology.
So yeah,
you know what? As I said at the beginning, and I wasn't just saying it to be nice, but I really, really am honored that you've given me this opportunity on your very excellent platform. And if anybody,
just someone, Erin saying she's popping back to say thanks.
Yeah.
Jerome saying Jerome's an atheist as well. He has major respect for you. I haven't seen someone who clearly cares more about the topic they're being interviewed on since I subbed. And Anam, who's a Trinitarian Muslim. So there's
oh my gosh.
Says, we love you for efforts, Mr. Sanfilippo.
My gosh. Well, let me just, if anybody wants to connect with me one-on-one, my Twitter handle is at Chaco Sanfilippo, and so I do accept DMs, even from people I don't know. Or if anyone thinks that email would be a better medium of correspondence, just go to orthodoxyindialogue.com, use the email address on the Contact Us page, and I am the one and only person who has access to that email account. So if you email Orthodoxy in Dialogue, I'm the only person who will see it. So if anybody needs to connect with me one-on-one, I might not be a functioning priest anymore. Oh, wow. That makes me want to cry. You're always welcome back. So yeah, and as I said earlier, if somebody connects with me one-on-one, and it seems that a telephone call or a Zoom conversation would be helpful, I'm really placing myself at the disposal of anyone of goodwill, even someone who disagrees with me, as long as they disagree with me from a good place.
Yeah.
So I promise my lips, you can wrap this up any way you like.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you for coming on. Your Twitter handle is in the description, and I think I can put links to, what's it called, academia.edu, where your master's thesis is and stuff. I'll put those in as well, so if people want to check those out, the links will be there for them to follow.
Right.
And then other than that, I mean, maybe you'll be on in future to discuss a similar topic or something different if you want. We can do something further down the line in a few months.
Oh, I would love that. I would love that. And I think your friend Spartan Theology wants to do an interview one of these days.
Oh, yeah, as he said, I can't see in the chat. Yeah, he's just said, thanks for the conversation. He enjoyed it a lot. Oh, has he messaged you, sorry, separately? Or...
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Well, right, yeah, he talked to me a little bit on Twitter.
Okay, right. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone for watching. If you've enjoyed the conversation, then be sure to like it, share it around with someone who you think might benefit from it, and also leave a comment just letting me know what you thought or what you'd want to see Giacomo, I'm going to pronounce it correctly, what you'd want to see us talk about in future. So thank you everyone, and I'll end the stream there.
Thank you everybody for